Welcome to my podcast. Today I'm talking about scary stories to tell in the dark. Should probably have the book up like this. That'd probably help. Now this book has been a good read lately. I'm going to be finishing it up shortly. I remember when I was a kid, I read this book a bit. I read the 3 books a long time ago. I was in elementary school, and the books that stood out to me in elementary school were Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and Goosebumps. Mostly because I like the horror reads. Those are the ones that popped out to me, made it interesting to watch. To read. I like the covers to look at and the designs that they had with the pictures. With the horror books and stuff. But this series, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the visual drawings that are part of this book are very awesome to look at. I really think that these are some of the most scary images that I've seen drawn. And it's got kind of an audience that is kids. Young kids is kind of designed for. To read to each other, to spook each other out. And I didn't get a chance to do this with other kids in my grade when I was in school, but I did get a kick out of reading the books and just kind of imagining the story in my head. This book series really, for me, made me want to read. Because the visual, the story. I always like spooky stories. That's something I really like. Something I'm kind of obsessed with still now, basically. When it comes to good scary stories, aspects that I like are like ghost stories, stories about zombies, stories about an intruder of some kind. And I've been reading the Scary Stories book recently, and I'm going to be getting done with it shortly. But some of the stories that have popped out to me that I found most interesting. For example, there's a story of a woman who she's away for a while, and she had a boyfriend, and that boyfriend died. And then she comes back to where she lived and where the boyfriend was. And he picks her up. The boyfriend picks her up. And he's dead, at this point. And she's like asking, why is he so cold to the touch? And she gives him like a bandana over his head to help him out in some kind of way because he's so cold. And she ends up finding out that he's been dead for like a while. And she opens up the grave and sees the bandana on the corpse. And that's a story that stuck with me from way back. I remember that story and thinking like, wow, this is a good spooky story. Some other ones I've been reading through here that I've really enjoyed. This one's a ghost story where this guy, he's kind of in the middle of nowhere, basically, and he's walking up this alley, and people are so afraid of him. He's wondering, why are these people scared of me? What's up with this? He doesn't know where he is or why he's there until he reaches a phone, calls his wife. Wasn't able to reach his wife, but he learns what happened to him. Basically, he had died earlier in the day, and he's a ghost now. That's kind of how it ends. Basically how it ends. It just ends there, and it's just like, oh, that's an interesting thought to be left with. I'm trying to think of some of the other stories that I've got here that I like to kind of talk a little bit about as I've been reading them. And the ones that have popped out to me are some of the ghost stories, stuff like that. But kind of taking a look at the book right now. There's one where these two people, they're taking a walk, and they're both afraid of each other. And then, they just end up startling each other. That's the story. And the way it's phrased, it sounds kind of spooky. But that's basically the story right there. And it's a story called The Walk in this book. So yeah, that one's a really good read that I really enjoyed. Kind of looking through the book for some of the other ones that I haven't mentioned yet that I've read up to. A lot of scary stories in this book, and I'm going to be finishing it up shortly. But I like to talk about it a little bit. Trying to figure out one. Kind of looking through here and this was this one. The Guests. Ooh, yes. That's one that I remember. That one stuck with me. Basically, this couple, they go to this house, and they stay the night, and basically, the people there, they're having them as the guests, are like, you don't need to pay us any money. They're like surprised. They're like, why can't we give you some money? And they don't really go into it. But then after they leave and they set some money on the table just as some kind of compensation, they leave, and they find out that the house was burnt down, and it had been burnt down a while, and that 2 people died in that house. And that when they go back to the house that they stayed at, there's no house there, and their money is still on the table. And I thought that was an interestingly spooky story, that it was like, okay, that's a creative concept about going to a house and then finding out that the people in there aren't really alive. I like ghost stories. I really do. Those stories kind of, they stick with me a bit. Kind of trying to find some other ones I saw here. Oh, here's a good one. The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. That storyline. And as I'm telling these stories, I'm trying to tell them my way of telling them, because I am not going to read from this book. I am not, as I'm doing this podcast. That's not what I'm doing. I'm going to talk about the stories that stuck with me as I read through so far, and I'm going to be finishing up this book shortly. Just want to re-mention that there's one called The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. Basically, to sum it up, this girl ended up scaring herself to death through her own kind of stupidity. Basically, she stuck her knife down, kind of like as a marker of some kind, and it gets caught on her dress. She thinks something's grabbing her, and she's so scared, she ends up dying. Basic story, pretty much the story right there. And I thought, wow, that's a good twist, is that she scared herself. Nothing supernatural got her. She got herself. But I do believe that I've heard of like actual stories of somebody being scared to death. Like I've heard like a legitimate story on the news that was kind of similar, where somebody startled themselves to death through shirt getting caught on something, or something pointless, that and they were so scared because it was like nighttime that they couldn't see. Their vision was distorted in some kind of way, and they couldn't see anything, and that's what scared them the most. It's kind of like in Jaws, for example. Like what you don't see kind of builds the terror. Like not seeing the shark builds the terror. The last part of the film when you start seeing the shark, I think, was kind of, for me, the part where it's like, yeah, this is still a good part of the story, but the fear is a little bit less because I see the shark now, The original Jaws, you just kind of had your imagination to play with a little bit there. And that kind of built up the shark character a bit. Then when you see the shark, you're like, okay, yeah, it works, but, one thing that I think really works for a good horror story is having some way for the audience to kind of imagine it themselves, the monster. Because if you see the monster, the scare is it disappears a bit because you know what the monster looks like. You know, it disappears a little bit, depending on how scary the monster looks. Though, it could be still, like, oh my gosh, but. Sometimes I've seen in movies where the monster doesn't really look that scary, and then they show the monster, and they hint at the monster for a long while, and then they show the monster, and you're like, yeah, a little scary, but I liked it better when they were describing the monster to each other. Then there's this weird story about a horse, where there's this witch that turned a person who slept in a certain bed into a horse, and she rode him throughout the countryside, basically. And then eventually he gets revenge on her by turning her into a horse. And that was an odd story to read, but I thought it was interesting. I'm trying to find like another story that kind of stuck with me. Oh, here's a good one. There's room for one more. That, like, I encourage you to read them. I'm trying not to summarize them like too much, but what I got from them, I don't want to try to ruin the book series for you in this podcast. That's not my goal. I want to encourage you to read this book, Saga, because there's 3 scary stories books, but there's if you want them all in one, I'd recommend getting this book here, 3 books in one, because it's got all the books in like one big book. I think it makes it easier than trying to go book to book. The Room for One More story. That one stuck with me because it's like, oh, this person's being invited to join this group of people who are going to meet their end. And he almost ends up being there. He almost ends up joining them and perishing, but doesn't. And that story sticks with me because it's kind of like a premonition story where the person sees that there's something up, but it's really up to him in the end whether he perishes or doesn't. So, and it's a good story for that aspect there, because it's something to think about. Think about, like, what if you were invited to, like, for example, an elevator, and that was where your end would be. What if you were invited to a situation that led to your demise? Would you go along, or would you not? And would you like to know so you can avoid it? I really enjoyed that story. That's all. That's what I'm trying to get at. I really enjoyed that story. I know my explaining in this video is me, but I'm trying to do these podcasts and get them filmed and try and talk about this book series that I've been really getting into. Let's see here. There's a story about the hook hand, and I've heard the hook hand story several different ways. The way this book tells it, it's more kind of open-ended, like they hint at the hook hand person. But the basic story that's been around in a lot of different books and stories that I've even seen online and stuff about the hook-handed person is basically there's a person who has a hook for a hand, and they've escaped some mental institution, and there's this couple who basically are about to get it on. That's why I'm phrasing it. But out of fear about the hook-handed person, they leave. They head home. And in this story, they head home to find that the hook hand is on the door of the vehicle, the exterior of the door. At least that's the way I read it. And I saw a movie called Urban Legends, and it went through the hook hand story too. But they went a whole different direction with the hook hand story than this book does, where basically the boy gets out of the car only to get hung by the hook-handed killer. And the girl's freaked out because she thinks the hook hand is clawing at the top of the vehicle. And it's really just, which is terrible, her boyfriend hanging at the tree, and his foot is scraping the top of the car. And that's a different way they went with the story, and it's scary in itself. They got the high beam story in here too, which I've heard before. This book went on about it, and I think the scary stories in the dark itself. I mean, some of them are probably created for the book saga and stuff like that, but some of them are a collection of tales that were priorly told throughout probably, I think, other cultures and in different times in history, and different, basically going over a lot of different urban legends that have been told one way, but this book tells it in its own interesting way. But yeah, I've heard the high beam story here, and basically, this story, from the way I've heard it, can have two different endings. The way this story tells it, it's more of a happy ending, but the story goes two ways basically. There's this woman, she gets in the vehicle, and she thinks she's being followed, and she's freaking out. And in the story that I've heard, she goes to a gas station. The gas station attendant tells her that there's somebody in her car, and that she should not go back to her car. But the way the gas station attendant tells her, it kind of makes her wonder about the gas station attendant. And there's two ways the story can go, basically, from there. She'll either get in the car, and that'll be the end of her, because in her disbelief, she'll ride with the person who's going to kill her. Or she believes the gas station attendant, and basically, the person in the car is caught. She's safe, in a way. The way this story's told is a little bit different than that, in the aspect that it's somebody following the person on the road, and the reason why that she's being followed on the road is because of the person, her passenger, that she doesn't know about. And that's where it's a bit similar. And the person who's driving behind her is actively trying to save her, and manages to do it at the end of the story. But leaves you with something to think about, because it's like, oh geez. Getting about to the 20-minute mark here, and I feel like I've gone over a bit of the stories that I've read through, and I'm way over halfway at this point. I'm getting close to the end, and I like to talk about the recent and pretty good Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark movie that I have right here that I brought with me. I got a chance to see this one in theaters with a friend, and I gotta tell you, this movie is pretty spooky. They go their own way with the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark kind of storyline. Basically, it's more like they use the characters from the book as ways to take characters out of the movie. It's one of those stories where there's a final character left, and that character is the survivor of the movie. And I'm not saying that the other characters got killed off, but they all get captured, I guess is the nice way to phrase it, by these spooky beings that were part of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark story. And a lot of the characters in this book, or some of the big well-known ones that were popular in this book, are used in this movie to tell the story. I found it to be a fun time to watch. I really liked the aspect of it's each character for their own, basically. Like, they start out as a group, and as the movie goes through, the group gets smaller and smaller because they're all being taken out one by one by one, pretty much. And they're being taken out by the monsters in the Scary Stories book. And in theaters is an interesting experience because I got to hear the audience reaction of, oh geez, to the way that the costumes were made. Because you're bringing these drawings to literal life in this movie. That's what they were doing. And I found that to be a really good watch. And I feel like they hinted in this movie that they're going to do more with the story. I feel like they're going to, at some point, have a part 2 and part 3 of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.